Cherchez la Femme. Author's note. T. Jefferson Parker, he of Charlie Hood fame, was putting together a collection of short stories about fishing, and he asked me for a contribution. The anthology was published by the Countryman Press, and all royalties from sales went to two charitable organizations, Casting for Recovery and Project Healing Waters, which both help cancer survivors on the road to recovery by taking them fly fishing. So the story had to involve fishing. Mine does, several kinds, but only in the most glancing and peripheral way, in the vocations of the Beluda brothers. But mostly, I wrote this story because my friend Patty came home from one trip to the interior with a true story about a man, a woman, and a road grader. It was just too good to pass up. There is one in every village. They don't have to be young. They don't even have to be pretty. But there is one woman in every Alaskan village whose very presence short-circuits something in the nervous system of the male of the species, resulting all too often in events that spiral into intervention on the part of a professional peace officer. In the case of Dulcie Canine, the femme fatale came in a pleasant enough package. Medium height, nice curves, regular features. But with Dulcie, it was more attitude than pulchritude. Her hair was thick and black, and she wore it long, in a shining cape she could toss around her shoulders, and made a man think about wrapping it around his fist and hanging on for wherever the ride took him. Her eyes were a warm, wicked brown, and they had a way of peering from beneath already thick lashes so heavily mascaraed, it seemed her lids couldn't be strong enough to hold them up. She had a habit of using her tongue to toy with her teeth and the corners of her mouth, which she left open much of the time, as if she were about to take a bite out of whatever was nearest. Fry bread, smoked fish, that sensitive spot beneath the man's left ear. Most women hated her as much as their men loved her, of course. Margaret Mechanic had erupted into Bobby Clark's house when Marvin, that morning's guest on Park Air, had strayed from the advertised topic, which was the current red salmon run or lack thereof, to wax eloquent on what Dulcie hadn't been wearing at the roadhouse the night before. Dinah had banished both mechanics from the property and interdicted Marvin as an on-air guest ever again. And given the subsequent repair and replacement bills, you could see her point. And then there was the time Dulcie ran for Miss Naniltna and won, allegedly on the strength of the blueberry pie she baked for the talent competition. That was fine until Auntie Vi accused Dulcie's cousin Norma Allstad of baking the pie for her, which no way Norma would have done, given that little episode a while back involving Dulcie, Norma, and Norma's boyfriend, Chuck. Turned out Dulcie really had baked the pie, but was stripped of her crown anyway. Never a good idea to show up on the anti-radar, and Dulcie had made what Auntie Vi, with uncharacteristic restraint, had described as a nuisance of herself with more than one of the boarders at Auntie Vi's B&B. Auntie Vi could give a hoot what Dulcie did with whom, but she resented the need to wear earplugs to bed every night in her own home. Sergeant Jim Chopin said that fully a third of the local call-outs to the Naniltna Trooper Post involved Dulcie Canine in some way. Either she was enticing men at the roadhouse to drink so she could drink with them, or she was seducing men away from their wives and sweethearts, or she was vamping men for cash, moose backstrap, or a free ride to Atna with Costco privileges thrown in. Or spurned suitors were getting drunk and wreaking mayhem and madness on a town too small to ignore either. The incident the previous winter involving Dulcie, Wasily Peterkin, and the road grader was still a painful subject to everyone concerned. Dulcie and the Beluda brothers. Anybody should have been able to see it coming, but nobody did until it was far too late. There were 3 Beludas, Albert, Nathan, and Boris. Their father had been a commercial fisherman. Their mother had worked as his deckhand until Albert was 7 and big enough to take her place. She returned to their house at the edge of the rickety dock on the river and seldom left it again, the last time when they buried her next to their father out back. She'd been a quiet woman, and her eldest, Albert, took after her. He was 28 now, a steady, serious, capable, reliable man. He'd inherited the Mary B. outright, along with his father's Alleganic Bay drift permit, and fished it every summer, coming in high boat 2 out of 3 years, and piling up a healthy balance in the bank in Cordova. Winters he worked on the Mary B. in dry dock and on his gear in the net loft over the dock. Albert inheriting the Mary B. was a source of friction with the youngest brother. Boris was 22 and self-involved, opportunistic, loud, and lazy. He fished subsistence when he worked at all, but his smoke fish was the best on the river and, packed in fancy balsa wood cases, 12 8-ounce jars to a case, sold at a hefty premium to the clientele of Dmitri Moonin's high-end lodge up in the Quelac foothills. He made a mouth-watering caviar from the eggs, too, for a list of subscribers from as far away as New York City. Every batch sold out months before it was in the 1-ounce jars. It was enough to keep him in beer and Edwin jeans. Boris was also a bit of a dandy, who had been known to fly all the way to Anchorage for the right haircut. Nathan, 25, was a typical middle child. He worked summers for Dmitri, guiding Dmitri's clients to the best fishing streams in the Quelacs so they could beat the water for record kings. Winters he worked on the Mary B.'s moving parts, paid minimum wage by the hour, and kept all their vehicles running for fun. He was cajoling and conciliatory, and could charm the most obstreperous client out of a sulk, which made him invaluable to Dmitri, who paid him accordingly. They all lived together in their parents' house, managing to coexist for the most part in peace, until Dulcie Canine came along. Well, Dulcie didn't come along exactly. She'd always been there. Born a park rat to a typical park rat family, part Russian, part Aleut, part Norwegian. Her father fished and drank. Her mother had babies and drank. The eldest, Dulcie, fell heir to the babysitting and housekeeping chores early on. When her mother died, her father began to use her as a stand-in for other things as well. She stood it until she was 16, when Nick Totemoff told her he loved her. It was the first time anyone had ever said that to her. She eloped with him to Cordova that night. Nick had been motivated by what young men are usually motivated by, and he'd disappeared within a month, leaving her on her own. She got a job bartending at the Alaska Club, and the tips allowed her to rent a tiny mother-in-law apartment. It was her own home, her first, and, as it turned out, her only, because her father came into the Alaska Club in the middle of the following fishing season and tried to haul her out across the bar. The damages included her job. The next day, Jim Chopin brought her the news that on the way back to his boat, her father had fallen into the small boat harbor and drowned. Her next oldest sibling was 14. There was no one else to take care of her 3 brothers and 2 sisters. She went back to Niniltna, sold her father's boat and permit to Anatoly Martyshev, and that and their quarterly NNA shareholder payments, their annual PFD from the state, and their parents' Social Security death benefits, managed to keep the family together in the little log cabin with the loft. Cramped, crowded, with no running water and an outhouse out back, everyone took turns splitting firewood for the oil drum stove, and no one went hungry. Which didn't necessarily turn Dulcie into a pattern card of respectability. There were men. There were a lot of men. She had been forced to a realization of her power early on. She knew how to use it. And it didn't help that she was a walking, talking example of chaos theory. And so, inevitably, Eulalie Anahonik, that self-appointed moral arbiter of village and environs, took exception to Dulcie's behavior, and further, took it upon herself to call DFYS. They didn't show for almost a year. When they did, they spent 10 minutes evaluating the situation before scooping up the 5 minors and shipping them off to 4 different foster homes in Etna, Anchorage, and Valdez. Dulcie didn't fight them. Some said she just didn't care. Some said she was relieved to be rid of the burden. Some thought she figured she couldn't win against the state, so I try. Instead, she got a job waiting tables at the Roadhouse, in spite of stiff opposition from Jim Chopin, who was already spending too many duty hours breaking up brawls between Suulatuk miners and park rats fighting over the same girl. Putting Dulcie in the Roadhouse seemed to him like rolling a nuke into a firefight. The resulting explosion was predestined, and the fallout would be toxic to everyone in range for a long time. To his surprise, indeed, to the park's collective surprise, Dulcie managed to suppress whatever incitements to riot she had hardwired into her DNA for the hours she was on duty. Off-duty was another matter, and most of her off-duty hours were spent at the Roadhouse. Hard to tell when she first started hooking up with the Beluda brothers, and no one ever did figure out if it was serially or concurrently. Everyone remembered the fight Nathan and Boris got into that April, though. It had already been a notable evening, what with Pastor Nolan having confessed his affair with Patsy Aguilar, and his wife sitting right there at the congregational table. Then there was the group of climbers who, having summited Big Bump, had come in for their requisite shots of middle finger. It was always fun to see their expressions when Bernie took down the unmarked bottle of Everclear with the forefinger floating in it. And then the fight had erupted and spread to engulf Pastor Nolan's parishioners, the Big Bumpers, and the quilting bee in the corner, where it upset 3 of 4 Irish coffees. The aunties were pretty pissed about that. So was Dulcie when she had to clean up the mess. And then it became blindingly obvious what the fight had been about, as Nathan and Boris vied with one another to rush bar rags to the scene, and then got into another fight over who was allowed to carry the dirtied rags back. Dulcie twitched her fine behind around the bar and fixed Bernie with a fiery glance. "I didn't start that." "I saw," Bernie said, and got out the baseball bat. Fortunately, Albert walked in and broke it up before Bernie had to break any heads. Now, you'd think that would have been it, spleen vented and honor satisfied. But instead, things seemed to escalate. That spring, Nathan guided a couple of salmon hunters to one of the secret streams where Canoeyak River kings of trophy size came home to spawn, and found Boris there already, tromping back and forth in hip waders, muddying the waters and scaring everything with a fin 2 creeks away. He was carrying a dip net. Said he was fishing for female kings so he could make his caviar. Nathan's clients, who had the look of very good tippers, didn't so much as get their lines wet. A couple of weeks later, Boris was fixing to set up his fish wheel. It was a lot of work, and Boris didn't put in that kind of effort unless he was certain of a return. So he'd spent the previous week watching the river, watching the reds run, and coming up with a pretty fair estimate of when they'd hit his beach. Once the fish wheel went into action, it stayed in action until he'd caught his limit. Then he packed up the whole shebang and brought it and the fish back to the house. Only this time, once he'd loaded all the parts in his pickup, driven the 40 miles to the trailhead, humped all those same parts down a mile of rough and more or less vertical trail to the gravel bank, and started to assemble the wheel, he found all the bolts missing. There were other incidents, and the queer thing was that in between them, Boris and Nathan maintained an outward civility. They would show up at the Roadhouse and take turns courting Dulcie, where under Bernie's watchful eye they were as polite as ever they could be, to each other and to everyone else. It's real amusing to watch, Bernie told Jim, and it feels like sitting on top of an unexploded bomb. Jim talked to Albert, who shrugged. What am I supposed to do? Give them a timeout? They're adults. They screw up, you can lock them up. Maybe it's Dulcie ought to be locked up. That earned him a sharp look. Not her fault my brothers are making fools of themselves over her. Jim, ashamed, said, I know. I'm just worried somebody's going to get hurt. The Mary B. strained at her moorings. Boys aren't dumb. I'll figure things out eventually. Meantime, I got a tide to catch tomorrow and too much to do between now and then. Albert laid a hand on the gunwale and vaulted on board. The park waited, holding its breath. The very next day, Jim was in his office at the Post when he heard a commotion in the outer office. He got to his door in time to see Boris Beluda, covered in blood, yelling, She's dead! She's dead, I'm telling you! She's dead! And he killed her! She, it transpired, was Dulcie Canine, and it wasn't Boris's blood. He'd acquired it when he went to Dulcie's place, went in and found it on the couch, on the coffee table, and on dish towels and hand towels wrung out into the sink. He'd torn the place apart looking for a body and hadn't found one, which he guessed was how he'd gotten blood all over himself. Jim went to the tiny little cabin. Dulcie wasn't there. The scene was about as bad as Boris had described it. And since Auntie Edna lived next door and kept a weather eye out for the goings and comings of her neighbors, she had seen Boris go in that morning and come out again not 5 minutes later, not quite as spick and span as he had gone in. He had placed no bundles in his pickup, however, and buried nothing mysterious in the yard. He had shouted greetings at Albert, who had only a moment before loosed the lines of the Mary B., preparatory to heading downriver to Alleganic Bay in the next fishing period. Jim, his heart sinking, drove around looking for Nathan's pickup. He found it parked in front of the post office, and Nathan himself coming out the post office door. He gaped at Jim's questions. No, he hadn't been to Dulcie's place in the last 24 hours. He hadn't seen Dulcie in 5 days, come to that. He'd been up at the lodge guiding Dimitri's fishermen to trophy mounts for their corner office walls. At the post, Nathan saw Boris's red-stained hands and launched himself at his brother. Jim pulled out the capstan, told the dispatcher to vacate the premises, and emptied the canister on the brothers. He followed Maggie outside and held the door closed until the brothers stopped screaming and started sobbing. Afterward, he put Boris in one cell and Nathan in another, over the vociferous objections of both. No Dulcie, a lot of blood, and 2 brothers in a fierce competition for the affections of the same woman. Dimitri Moonin confirmed Nathan's alibi. Auntie Edna confirmed Boris's. Jim went back to Dulcie's cabin with his murder bag. One room with a loft for sleeping, the cabin's floor plan was a familiar one. On the ground floor there was a wood stove for heat, an oil stove for cooking, a sink and a counter with shelves above and below, a small dining table with mismatched chairs, a battered couch, a coffee table, some brick and board shelves. Electricity had been added post-construction, and there were wires tacked to the log walls everywhere. One end of the dark blue corduroy couch was stained with blood. He took photographs. The coffee table, a relic of George Jetson's living room circa 1962, was staggering on the corner nearest the stained end of the couch. Upon closer examination, that corner had a preponderance of blood on it, along with a quantity of short, dark hairs. On the table were 2 place settings, plates, knives, forks, and the remains of a pork chop, green bean, and applesauce dinner, for the most part unconsumed. Meal interrupted. Upstairs, the bed looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Covers slid to the floor, bottom sheet holding on by one corner, mattress cattywampus on the box springs. Dulcie's clothes were stacked neatly on more brick and board shelves under the eaves, though. He couldn't tell if any were missing. He took more photographs, bagged the sheets from the bed, some samples from couch and coffee table and sink, and returned to the post, where he spent some time writing a timeline of events, and some more time in thought. Then he sent for Kate. Kate Shugak was a lifetime park rat and a private investigator who took on the occasional job for the state at his behest. 5 feet, 120 pounds, hazel eyes tilted at the corners, short cap of black hair. She had a presence that reminded him of that line somebody, maybe Shakespeare, had written, "Though she be but little, she is fierce." Her size was indeed deceptive, for she was strong as an ox, quick as a snake, and smarter than the average bear. She was also related to most of the park either by blood or by marriage, which made her a walking, talking repository of park history going back generations. Whoever was voted most likely to, odds were Kate knew them, knew where they lived, and could bring them in without mess or bother. She was sort of like shorthand for the Alaska State Trooper presence in the park. The park covered 20 million square acres, and he was its only trooper. So she was the perfect resource, in more ways than one. She listened without comment as he ran down the story of Dulcie's disappearance, said, "I'll be back," and left without speaking to Boris and Nathan. "You unbelievable morons," Kate said 2 days later. Jim thought pretty dispassionately under the circumstances. Kate's tolerance for idiots was very low and well known. "She's not dead." Both brothers sat up at this.
"What do you mean?"
Nathan said.
"I saw the blood."
Boris said.
"It was all over you."
Nathan said. "Shut up," Kate said. They shut up. "She and Albert eloped," Kate said.
"What? What?"
They took the Mary B. to Cordova. Dulcie was hiding below when Boris and Auntie Edna saw Albert heading downriver. She looked at Jim. Whatever you said to him that day convinced him to talk to Dulcie. He waited. Nathan waited. Boris waited. Finally, Jim said, "And?" "Jim," she said, "it's Dulcie." "Oh," he said, and then repeated, "Oh." It turned into a very long talk. It lasted all night. Her expression dared him to laugh, which, recalling the disturbed state of Dulcie's sleeping loft, he was hard put to it not to do. The next morning, Albert, tripped and hit his head on the corner of the coffee table in front of the couch. Jim remembered the goo solidified on the corner of the coffee table. Albert's got a shiner on him the color of an eggplant, and he still can't see out of that eye. Dulcie mopped him up as best she could, and they got on the Mary B. and went downriver and to Cordova, where they were married that afternoon. She sat back and watched their various reactions, not without a certain satisfaction. "Boris, when you found all that blood, you said it was Nathan just for meanness. You knew he was working up at the lodge, didn't you?" Boris wouldn't look at her. He wouldn't look at anyone. "Nathan, Jim tells me you jumped Boris here at the post, and he had to pepper spray you to pull you off him." Nathan wasn't making eye contact either. "One way or another, you boys have made a spectacle of yourselves and caused a great deal of annoyance for the whole park for the last 6 months. There will be consequences." Everybody wondered what that meant. They were not held in suspense for long. "I talked to a few people on my way back here, and we've come up with something that looks a little like justice." Kate looked at Nathan. "Nathan, you're going to caretake Dimitri's lodge for him this winter. You get minimum wage, board and room, and a box of books. I'd recommend at least one of them be written by Deepak Chopra."
"Who else is going to be there?"
"No one." Nathan swallowed hard.
"I'm going to be up there all alone?"
"Yes."
"I won't go."
He looked at Boris, at Jim.
I won't go, Kate.
Yeah, you will, she said. You earned this, Nathan. You've pretty much proved yourself unfit for human companionship, at least in the short term. Take this winter and think about it. She looked at his younger brother. Boris, the mayor of Cordova has finally convinced Shitting Seagull to use up his accrued vacation time. You'll be the acting harbor master from October 1 to April 1, and yes, that does include keeping space open in transient parking for alien spaceships on their way through to Delta Epsilon. You'll be living in Gull's quarters in the harbor, and you'll be on call 24/7 for the whole 6 months.
What? Why, you...
I can think of no punishment better suited to fit your crime than to spend 6 months serving the public. You'd better be polite to them. If I get to hear of otherwise... She let the words trail off into an artistic silence.
So, Dulcie Canine's alive and well and in Cordova with Albert Beluda,
Jim said in his office. Mutt, the half-gray wolf, half-husky who let Kate live with her, was watching her favorite man with the usual adoring look in her great yellow eyes. No, actually, she's in Anchorage. They both are.
What for?
They're at the Division of Family and Youth Services applying for custody of Dulcie's younger siblings.
Really?
Jim let the words stretch out.
So that was her price.
Kate shrugged.
And Albert's?
Ratio of men to women in the park used to be 7-1. Since the mine opened, it's probably more like 20-1. And you know how long most women stay here who weren't born to it.
Well, Albert's got one of his very own now. Let's hope he doesn't know he has a tiger by the tail.
Think about it, Kate said. Albert's the head of his family. Dulcie's the head of hers. They do sort of fit. I don't know that it's a happy ending, but it may actually be the right one.
Well, you have to hand it to her. She went through every guy in the park until she found the right one. And speaking of tigers, just what happened that morning?
Well, Kate looked as if she were trying to decide how much it was good for him to know. As near as I can figure, Dulcie made the mistake of smiling at Albert on their way out the door, which naturally Albert regarded as an invitation to kiss her. One thing led to another, and they still had an hour to make the tide, so things got a little athletic out. He let his eyes drop down over her body, lingering here and there.
I can see how that might happen.
Her answering smile was long and slow and full of promise. Jim left the boys locked in their cells, dimmed the lights, and went home, promising to let them out the next morning. An hour passed, another. The July sun tracked around the walls, lessening in intensity but still omnipresent. Of course, Nathan spoke first, and of course it was conciliatory.
She sure was cute.
He spoke of Dulcie in the past tense, as if she was dead. A long silence.
Yeah,
Boris said, drawing it out.
Did you see that little tattoo on the inside of her? Yes, Boris,
Nathan said.
I saw it.
He sighed and rolled over to look at his brother through the bars.
I guess now all three of us have seen it.
Silence. A reluctant rumble sounded from the other cell. A moment later, they were both laughing.